I'm going to grab some coffee and I'm listening while I'm gone. Okay.
All right, there we go. So what does it mean to be spiritual but not religious? So today's question is one that is going to be very challenging for me to present in a non-biased way. Everything that we talk about always, of course, is colored by our experiences and our opinions and things like that. But I have to tell you that on this particular issue, I have a very strong opinion and I'm not going to be able to keep it to myself very easily. So I'll throw that out there. I'm going to do the best I can to lay things out in terms of facts at the beginning, but then we're going to start to get into a little bit of kind of analysis of this position and the people who do it, adhere to it, take it on as an identity. And I do not have a lot of good things to say. So if you feel like you connect in some way to this, or you know someone who connects in some way to this, then I'm sorry, but I'm also not sorry, and you'll see why. So here we go. So for assumptions, I want us to just look at these two concepts, because we're talking about spirituality and religion, and how do these two things connect to each other? So when do I want to do this? Actually, let's start here. I want to just talk for a couple minutes about, we've got this phrase, spiritual but not religious, that is very popular. It's an interesting phrase in that it in itself is fairly new. It kind of started to become more popular in the turn of the century. Oh, that makes me feel so old. But it actually kind of has very old roots. Even in the Reformation period, we all know Luther and Calvin and these big names of the people that kind of founded all these different strains of denominations that came out of the Reformation period. But there were other people who got very frustrated with the way that the Luthers and Calvins, and even the Anabaptists, the ones that were persecuted by the Luthers and Calvins, the way that they were kind of limiting themselves and cutting short what they felt was the fullness of what needed to be reformed about the church. And they ended up being called spiritualists. They do not survive today as kind of a movement, because they're intentionally trying not to be part of an institution. And without institution, of course, it's very difficult to survive for a long time. But it was a movement of people who felt that the rigidity of the church, even after the Reformation, was hypocritical, was antithetical to what God was calling people to do. And so they left even the Reformed churches or the Lutheran churches, or even the Anabaptist churches where they baptized it as adults, and kind of had their own thing going on. The closest we can get to a group today that is influenced in some way by this spiritualist movement would be the Quakers, people who don't really have a lot of ritual and organization to their gatherings, people who kind of have a very internalized spirituality, spend a lot of time in meditation and silence and things like that. But now we've kind of got this resurgence, and now we've got this phrase, spiritual but not religious. And so as we talk through this today, I just want you to keep in your mind whether you even buy this idea of how spirituality and religion are divided, as I explained to you how it is that they are divided by people who claim this identity. And the other thing I want you to think about is, what would be the difference between spiritual but not religious and religious but not spiritual? Does that exist? Is that a thing? Because I think that when you say spiritual but not religious, you are assuming there are people out there who are spiritual and religious, and perhaps even that there are people out there who are religious but not spiritual. Or, some people who are really hardcore in this group might say that religion is actually antithetical to spirituality, and I'll talk a little bit more about that in a little bit. But does anybody have any initial thoughts about that, especially that idea of, religion, religious but not spiritual versus spiritual but not religious? What do you think that might mean?
Well, maybe being religious means following certain rituals and beliefs and things like that, whereas spiritual might mean being in touch with God in your life or something like that. I don't know. But I can understand how it's probably really difficult to separate the two.
Yeah, I think so. But these groups have it very well defined, and we'll talk more about.
So would religious then refer to people that are more prone to just following the creed, like rather more blindly than without more inner work with it?
So that's what this group would say, yes. So just keep those in mind. I know that this is very early on in a conversation, and so we can talk more about that as we go through. But in terms of assumptions within this question, I wanted to just spend a few minutes talking about each of these categories on its own. And these are still, what I'm sharing with you is not like dictionary definitions of these words. I'm sharing with you what people who claim this identity of spiritual but not religious, they call themselves SBNR for short, how they would define these words. So what does it mean to be religious? Well, according to the SBNR people, being religious means adhering to institutions and practices. It means practicing your spirituality according to external authorities, being told what to believe and how to believe it and how to show it in your everyday lives or in your religious practices. It's about doctrine and dogma and ritual practice. It's about traditional, quote unquote, traditional kinds of spiritual practices like reading scriptures, formalized prayer, even group retreats and meetings are often seen as part of this religion thing that is rejected by the SBNR people. They emphasize that religion is usually inherited from the parents and therefore is probably unexamined, probably blindly accepted and not considered, not chosen by the individual person because they just kind of take what their parents teach them and go with it. And religion makes at least some claims that are seen as absolute or an eternal truths. And this is part of, I think, why SBNR is becoming more popular, because we, actually not even really anymore, but for a while there, we were living in what was called the postmodern age. And postmodernism emphasizes the subjective experience of the individual, that very little, if you're a full postmodernist, you believe that there is nothing objective, that everything is subject to the interpretation, the experience, the opinion of the individual person. And so now we actually kind of live in a world where we're criticizing that position. And so some people call that postmodernism. But postmodernism, in postmodern world, everything is subjective, everything is contextual. There are no absolute truths. And so religion is criticized as a place where, you are imposing your ideas on someone else. And within a postmodern worldview, that's not appropriate. You should never do that. So for a lot of these people who claim this SBNR identity, not all of them, but for many of them, they actually believe that religion takes away your spirituality. It removes any possibility for spiritual experience because the weight of your tradition is placed upon you. You blindly perform formalized rituals. You participate in this dried up application of the rituals and processes that have been handed on to you. And by forcing you to do these things, the people who have power maintain that power over you. And so this is the way that religion is interpreted by SBNR people. So I'm not going to say anything more about that right now, but obviously I have a lot to say about it very soon. So on the other side, what does it mean to be spiritual? Well, spirituality means curiosity and openness. It means that you prioritize your emotional and psychological well-being. Spirituality is about the heart. It's about your feelings. It's about your experiences. There is a professor of psychology of religion at Bowling Green State University named Kenneth Pargament, I guess. And he says that spiritual is a term that people like to use. It has all of these positive connotations of having a life with meaning, a life with some sacredness to it. You have some depth to who you are as a human being. So where this concept kind of comes from, at least in its modern usage, is from people who didn't want to be affiliated with any particular religious tradition, but they also felt like atheist is too harsh a word. Atheism brings up, staunch God haters who are out there, trying to convince everybody that they're stupid for believing in God or stupid for participating in religion. And these people don't feel that way. They don't want to be associated with that very hard-lined position, but they also don't want to be associated with a particular religious tradition. And so they claim this term spirituality as something that gives them what they feel is more meaning, more depth to their human experience than someone who rejects spirituality entirely and says there's nothing else out there. And so ultimately, I think being spiritual means that you maintain the hope that there is something more to life than just the random chemical reactions that make up the world, biology and chemistry and our brain chemistries and things like that. There's something more, something bigger, but we don't necessarily want to identify what that is. Some people do. They just don't attach it then to a religion, but others won't at all. And then spirituality, I think also in general, is about the journey rather than the destination. It's about the process of seeking. It's about being a questioner. It's about the search, but it's not about actually finding anything necessarily. And so spirituality, the idea of focusing on spirituality rather than religion, grows out of an assumption. And this assumption is that genuine religious experience, meaningful spirituality, must always be spontaneous and personal and based on your feelings in that moment. And so spirituality, genuine religious experience, is spontaneous, personal, and based on your feelings about it. And so, for example, somebody who adheres to this in a very hardline way would come into a Lutheran service, and they would say that nothing that we do can be considered a true spiritual experience because it's all written out. None of it's spontaneous. It's all corporate, and so there's nothing personal about it. It's all based on your actions and your participation, not your feelings. And so it can't actually provide you with any kind of spiritual experience. So you can see why this is problematic for me, but I'm not going to say anything yet. We're going to keep trying to be just descriptive here.
Oh my.
So ultimately, actually, it's interesting because while the spiritual but not religious want to not be associated with religion, in America at least, the SBNR movement is very firmly based in the revivalist movements of the mid 1800s, and then that slowly morphed into what we now call Pentecostalism. The very experiential, personal savior kind of thing, spontaneous prayer, spontaneous worship, spontaneous participation, those types of things is very much a part of the Pentecostal program. But the difference between a Pentecostal and an SBNR is that they don't even want the trappings of the Pentecostal belief system. They believe that that is imposed unnaturally on top of people. And so that holds them back from having their best spiritual experiences that they can have. So, spiritual, religious. Any questions at this point? I am not going to answer your questions that are judgmental because I'm trying really hard to stay in line here until we get to the point where we're ready to start talking about that. But any just factual, theoretical questions at this point?
So repeat, when the SBNR really kind of started, was in the 20th century?
It was kind of like around the turn of the 20th to 21st century. About,
you mean like 22 years ago?
Yes.
Oh.
Maybe a little earlier than that, you could see some of it, but it's not very, it like I said before, it's new in terms of this particular identifier is fairly new, but it's also connected to a lot of older traditions, including those spiritualists from the late 1500s, and like I said, you can see a progression through the revivalist movement, and of course, American independence and freedom and all these types of things are part of the ideas, and then Pentecostalism, but that kind of doesn't go far enough for an SBNR, regardless of what particular Christian denomination they come from. And they're not all Christians. Some of them are Muslims or Jews or Buddhists, and anybody can become an SBNR at any time. But in America, because we have more Christians, more of them happen to be post-Christians, or the nuns, the people who grew up with no religion and aren't interested in learning anything about the history and rituals of a religion. All right, so next we're going to talk about who these people are, what are the demographics, and what do they believe. So first, let's talk about some demographics. So the SBNR people, generally speaking, are more likely to be women. They are more likely to live on the West Coast. They are more likely to come from the baby boomer or Gen X populations, generations. They tend to be more politically liberal or moderate. In fact, 85% of them claim liberal or moderate. Only 15% claim to be conservatives. And they are often white when they claim SBNR specifically. So this makes sense. In all religious and spiritual groups, women make up, a higher percentage than men. Obviously, the West Coast has more liberals in general than around other places in the country, so that also makes sense. The West Coast also, I'm not just talking, when I say the West Coast, I'm not just talking about the actual coast itself, but even, into the Southwest, which has a lot more indigenous American Indian, Native American influence. And a lot of that has to do with this SBNR thing, which we'll talk about a little bit when we get to our analysis part of our conversation. And it's a little surprising at first when you think about, why would it be boomers and Gen X that are in this group? But what that really means is that people and the generation that came before the boomers is really starting to die out much more now, because those people are in their 90s and even hundreds at this point. But before, those people were much more likely to be part of a worshiping community and not really ever question it. And then on the other end, millennials and the whatever we're calling the next generation, the Gen Y, or I don't know what we're calling them these days, are much more likely to just reject religion entirely and not claim an identity like this. Just reject spirituality and have nothing to do with any of it. So it's kind of that middle group of people who, as they started to age, were not finding what they were looking for in the church or in the mosque or, you know, wherever it was that they were. And so they rejected it. And they felt comfortable doing that because, you know, they had lived through the 60s when there was a lot of upheaval and changes in institutions and kind of a focus on the rights of the individual and the power of the people and things like that. And so it makes sense that generation would feel this way, that if you're not feeling satisfied, you don't just stick it out, you go your own way, you do what you are going to do. So what do these people believe? Well, it's a very broad group, but we can say a few things about them. So 27% of people from one of the studies that I read, 27% of the group believes that God is not an entity. God is what they call a state of higher consciousness. And so more than 1/4 of the group, at least at the time of this particular study, didn't think that God was, you know, out there. They believe that God is just the word that we use to define a higher state of consciousness. And so they usually believe in something that's larger than themselves. It can be God, a concept similar to what Christians or Jews have about God, or a concept similar to what Buddhists or Hindus have about gods. But it could also be a concept. It could be art, it could be music, it could be poetry, it could be human kindness, you know, something larger than themselves that they're striving for, but it doesn't have to be this concept God. It can be something else. And often it is. There is a focus and energy directed at diversity and the freedom of the individual. And so this is why it's kind of hard to pin down exactly what these SBNR people believe, because it's for me, I figure it out myself. It doesn't matter what anybody else says, what anybody else believes, I get to decide. So about half of the group in the study that I looked at claimed that they believe that they would label themselves as monotheistic. They believe that there's one God or one higher power of some kind. And the other half claimed the label polytheistic, that there's more than one God or more than one set of powers that are beyond myself. So it's about half and half. 41% in this particular study agreed that God is everywhere. So only 41%. And that is opposed to 92% of Christians, people who claim to be Christians, said that God is everywhere. And 98% of evangelical Christians said that God is everywhere. So a very small percentage agreed with the statement God is everywhere among the SBNRs versus the Christians. Here's an interesting one. About half of the SBNR people agreed with the statement that religion is mostly harmful. So 50% believe that religion is mostly harmful. The others chose, you know, partially harmful or not harmful at all. I think there's a difference between believing that something is harmful and believing that something isn't for you. And so it's interesting that half of them believe that religion is actively harmful, not just to themselves, but to other people too. And, you know, to some degree, I agree with them on some things that happen within religion. I'm just not ready to throw out the baby with the bathwater is all. But we'll get to that in a minute. Stop talking about that. About 70% of SBNR people believe that all religions teach basically the same thing. They don't believe that there's really much of a difference between the different religions in terms of what they teach. Less than 10% of these people talk about spiritual matters with their friends often, and about half of them rarely or never talk about it with their friends. And I think that, that kind of fits, because this is all about personal practices, personal choices. People who claim SBNR talk about how they like spending time in nature, they like doing yoga, they like to meditate, they like to spend time in silence or solitude. And so it's about me, it's about what I feel is necessary and important for my spiritual life and for me to be spiritually healthy. And so it doesn't make any sense for me to talk to anybody else about it, because it's up to me to figure it out. What you're doing is completely irrelevant to what I'm doing to make sure that my spiritual life is fulfilling. And some people who are SBNRs would say things like they're pretty, much more hardcore than some of the others, but they would say things like the structure and the rigidity of institutions is one man that I read in one of the articles that I looked at said that the institution of the church is antithetical to everything Jesus represents. So this particular person believes in Jesus. He is there. There's another category that we could talk about on another day if we want, called people who love Jesus but not the church. And so this particular person identifies in that way. So he claims to be a Jesus follower, but he is not a Christian. He is not someone who participates in the Christian church, because he thinks that the structure and rigidity of the institution of the church is antithetical to everything Jesus represents, according to his reading of scripture, which he does on his own, and nobody else gets to tell him what to think or believe about it, because it's about me, it's about him and his personal positions. So again, questions, comments about the content. We're about to get into the good stuff.
Okay.
Well, I can understand that some of the practices of churches can be harmful to some people. And I mean, there's a wide variety of churches,
Yes, I do.
like those people that kiss snakes and stuff, or
Yep. Snake handlers.
they scare me. I could never be in a church where they had snakes.
No, me neither.
Not on purpose.
I guess I don't have enough faith, huh? All right, so I'm ready to get critical. Let's get critical. Anybody?
Okay.
Anybody? There you go. Karen's got it. Olivia Newton-John reference. All right, so I want to talk about three different ideas about this SBNR phenomenon that I want to talk about, kind of the pros and cons, the opportunities and challenges, however you want to define that. And the first area I want to talk about is that the SBNR movement allows for personal beliefs. And I think that, that can be positive in some ways. They claim to be independent seekers. They are people who value diversity and are inclusive. Anyone who is questioning their spirituality and looking for answers on their own is welcome. And so there's no judgment. There's no, well, I do this and clearly you are doing the wrong thing because my thing works really well. And I'm a little bit drawn to that kind of thing in that particular area, because I've had a lot of times in my life where, that I'm not a meditator. I'm not like sometimes we use the Lectio Divina, where you read a passage 3 times to try to allow the Spirit to kind of work in you and bring out the meaning of the passage to you. And I'm just not into that stuff. I'm not into meditating. I'm not into spending time by myself and thinking and pondering and praying for really long periods of time and stuff like that. And I've been judged quite a bit about that in my life. Pam?
Okay, so if these people are really independent, where are they getting together?
They're not.
They're not. So inclusive, I'm not clear about that. Who are they inclusive with if they're not getting together?
Well, they just don't judge anybody. If it ever comes up, which it rarely,
Which
seems
10%
to
of
rarely
the time
do.
it might. Okay. All
Yeah.
right. Okay. Got it.
So there's that, but I think that, very quickly, because it's all about me, it's all about my independent seeking, it's all about what works for me. Obviously, it can very quickly descend into egotism. It's all about me, what feels good to me, regardless of how it affects others. I don't really care about you. I don't care about what's going on with you because my spirituality is mine and mine alone. And then I think the other thing that's really important to point out here is that SBNR people claim that their spirituality is theirs alone and that they've discovered it on their own and that they're seeking out. But a lot of times what that looks like is colonization of non-Western religious practices. In the early days of this kind of movement, I remember there were a lot of articles around about, and they would, little news segments, and they would interview, and the people that they interviewed were, I never saw anyone that did not fit this profile. It was always a woman. She was always white, and she was always, somewhere in her 50s, maybe 60s. Every single time, it was always that woman. And what she did was talked about the various spiritual practices that she practiced that basically were just stealing from non-Western religions and removing the religious meaning from it. So they would be practicing yoga without understanding the deep Hindu philosophy behind why you do yoga and what it means and how it forms you. Or they would be consuming peyote and claiming that that was their religious right to do that, but without the native rituals, without the understanding through the indigenous groups that founded those types of practices. And so I have a really hard time taking seriously someone who says, well, I just figure this stuff out on my own, when it's a white person who is basically just stealing practices that they think are cool and interesting from marginalized groups. And that's a truth that I think is a very fair criticism of this SBNR thing. I also want to bring into the conversation some Christian criticism of this concept, because we are Christians and we're in a Christian Bible study together. This particular Bible study doesn't really have much of the Bible in it because these people don't believe the Bible. But I want to talk a little bit about the Latin concept of Incurvatus in se. This is a phrase that was coined by St. Augustine. So this is the late 300s, early 400s. But it was used very often, very frequently by Martin Luther, and then also by Karl Barth in the 1930s. And it means curved inward on oneself, curved inward on yourself. And so Augustine said, there's a quote, "Our nature, by the corruption of the first sin, is so deeply curved in on itself that it not only bends the best gifts of God toward itself and enjoys them, or rather even uses God himself in order to attain these gifts, but it also fails to realize that it so wickedly, curvedly, and viciously seeks all things, even God, for its own sake." And so Luther says that this is the very definition of sin, being curved in on yourself, being so focused on yourself and what you want that you completely forget that God is out there, that other people are out there. And this quote from Augustine, actually, for those of you who participated in the Violence in the Bible class, it reminds me a lot of the definition of biblical violence that we kind of were working with the whole time, which was the idea that you are stepping out of your place in the created order. You are trying to take what does not belong to you in the creation. whether it's God's power or the power of another person or the resources of another person. Biblical violence is about not sitting where you belong, and therefore basically trying to usurp God's role, trying to tell God that God doesn't know better than you do. And I think that's a criticism of this idea that about the personal beliefs, that you get to a certain point, and I'm not saying that we should never do any self-care, that we should never concern ourselves about ourselves and what we need spiritually or emotionally or psychologically or physically, but we have to balance that, I think, with the needs of others, with the call that God gives us, with the idea that I'm not the center of the universe, and so I've got some other people to consider. I've got the whole creation to consider. I've got who God has created me to be to consider. And if you don't do that, then you end up curving in on yourself, which is sin. That's what Luther says is the basic definition of sin. And so I think it's often an excuse to ignore the world. The Jesuit priest, James Martin, who I really like, said, if it's just you and God in your room and a religious community makes no demands on you, why should you help the poor? Why should you engage with the world? Why should you care about anybody but yourself? And so this actually is an interesting little phrase that a proponent of SBNR came up with, but I think that it is pretty damning. This person said, she sees no problem with people having a Burger King spirituality. You can have it your way. What's wrong with that? Well, I think there's a lot wrong with that, because spirituality should be about more than yourself. And SBNR people claim that they are seeking something bigger than themselves, but by their tactics are just turning themselves in on themselves. And so they're really never going to find it, as far as I'm concerned, because you don't find meaning for your life outside of yourself. You find meaning for your life in the faces of other people, in the needs of the creation, and, at least for me, in a relationship with God. And so that's my criticism in that area of this whole concept. So questions, comments on that before we move on to another one?
I find it interesting how this seems to relate. Our religion and our politics reflect each other. Even though they're supposed to be separate, they do reflect each other.
Oh yeah. There's no such thing in individuals. There's no such thing as separation of church and state. The state, is supposed to not dictate any particular religious tradition on people, but there's no such thing as separating your faith from your politics, because faith is about what you do, and your politics influence what you do.
My sister and her husband belonged to a church. It's probably like 15 years ago now. And there was an argument at church about the music. And so my sister and Roger and some of their friends quit going to the church and started having their own church, usually at my sister's house. And they have continued that, and they write their own sermons, and I think they have some music, but it's all interpreted. They interpret it. And my sister writes a lot of the sermons, and it just really, really bothers me, because it feels like exactly what you're saying. They're having it their way. They didn't like the main church telling them what to do. even though that wasn't what they were doing. But they decided that they could do it better. And I really struggle with that. You know, I love my sister, but I think she's flat out wrong on this. And anybody who thinks that they by themselves can interpret God and not follow. One of the things I like about the Lutheran Church is it goes back so far and it has so much tradition. And anybody who says that isn't spiritual doesn't know what they're talking about. But it really worries me that people think they can just do their own thing.
Oh, that's a perfect segue to our next section, Karen.
Good.
I want to talk next about the valuing of experience and intuition. And this is an area that is not just applicable to this conversation about the SBNR, because this has been an argument even within the church for centuries. How do we value the experiences of individuals, but also make sure that we maintain some kind of collective understanding and agreement on whether we're traveling in the right direction? For an SBNR person, their ideas help individuals, help humans make meaning out of their experiences. So it's not just, an endless series of cause and effect of logic. You're looking for patterns, you're looking for meaning within your experiences. And I think that's a really important part of being human. I think it's important for us to not just see our lives from a nihilistic standpoint, that everything just happens to you and there's nothing you can do about it and it doesn't mean anything and you live your life and then you die. That's a really hard way to live as a human, because we have this inclination toward meaning making. And so yes, the SBNR program, such as it is, the idea of coming up with your own meaning for the world and for your life is of value. But I think that idea that I get to make my own meaning can very quickly devolve into meaninglessness. If something is so subjective that it only applies to me, then that ultimately means that it is meaningless, because it doesn't mean anything outside of myself. So again, if we're SBNR people and we're trying to find meaning outside of ourselves and beyond ourselves, something that is larger than me, but that meaning that I find is meaningless for anyone but me, then have I really found meaning beyond myself, or have I just found meaning for myself? And how long can I sustain that until that subjectivity kind of crushes my sense of meaning, and then I end up with nothing? And I think that this concept of experience and intuition, it's important, and it's very important for a lot of different even Christian traditions and denominations. But this is an argument that's been happening for hundreds of years within the Christian church, of how do we balance the personal experiences of individuals and the work of the Holy Spirit in the world with tradition, with the sacred texts, with the sacred traditions that we hold to ourselves. Because people who participate in religion, who read sacred texts, who participate in traditions, who participate in rituals, don't think that what they're doing is replacing their experience and saying their experience is not valuable with these things. What they're doing is using those rituals and traditions and readings to help them to interpret their experiences in a way that helps them to make meaning out of them, and meaning that is truly beyond themselves, because that meaning that they find lets them connect their experiences with other people's experiences, and that helps them to build community, and then that helps them to have a better chance of learning and growing, because they are interacting with that environment. They're interacting with other people and their experiences and learning from them and sharing their experiences and participating in kind of the collective ideas that are growing and developing together. that they can say, well, this is my experience of what the Holy Spirit has been working on in my life right now. And another person can say, oh yeah, I agree with you. Or, hey, you know, my interpretation of what you're describing there doesn't really fit with what I believe God is. And so it's a conversation. It's an ongoing development together in a forward way. And so, you know, without that framework to give people a place to start to help try to find meaning, then you don't really have a choice but to start stealing from other groups that don't have the power to tell you not to, or just to, you know, end up just sitting in a room by yourself staring at the wall, and all of your ideas come crashing down around you because you realize that it doesn't mean anything to anybody but you. And so I think, you know, again, even within this category that, you know, I'm trying to start by finding some value in this thing. Yes, experience is really important, but I think all religious traditions would not argue against that idea. Even the most rigid, even the groups like the Catholics, that it's pretty much all about the ritual. The ritual itself brings meaning.
Yes.
And so to some people, you know, not everybody gets into that, but that's why we have Pentecostal churches. That's why we have, you know, evangelical churches that don't have as many rituals. They still have their own rituals, don't get me wrong. They just don't call it that, you know. So lastly, I want to talk about how another positive thing with this SBNR thing is that it rejects the hypocrisies of religion. And that doesn't, I kept typing hypocrisies over and over again, and it kept telling me that I was spelling it wrong, but that just doesn't seem like it's right to me, but it doesn't matter. So I think that the SBNR people are in a position where they could help some religious people to reform, to bring positive change to their traditions, if they're willing to engage. A lot of times they're not, because they don't really care what other people are doing. It's about what I'm doing. But they might, you know, if you, especially if you're the kind of person who came out of a religious tradition to this SBNR kind of position, if you still have friends and connections within those groups, you could help to bring some reform and positive change to your denomination, to your tradition, and help to kind of, you know, address some of those hypocrisies and some of those problems. It's also often a welcoming, not space because they don't gather together, but, you know, just kind of a welcoming community for people who have experienced abuse and trauma at the hand of organized religion. So people who have you know, been poorly treated in their lives, whether it's physical abuse or emotional abuse or spiritual abuse, people who have gone through those types of religious trauma, when they come out of those places, but they still have that deep desire to find God, to find some meaning beyond themselves, they can often find community, find help with these types of people who want to share with them their way of doing things, their ideas, and not to say, I'm going to, you know, take you on and show you my way so that you can do exactly as I do, but to show them that there is another way to do religion, to do spirituality, that you don't have to go to a place where people dictate to you what you should believe and what you shouldn't, and what you should do and what you shouldn't. So I think those are positive things. But I think that they often just use stereotypes to bring their assumptions about different positions. And I'm going to talk about Christianity because I know Christianity and because it's the most you know, popular religion in America. But when you talk to your average SBNR person, they're going to say that Christians are hypocrites. Christians believe that you know, God is angry. No, God loves you, but only if you know, do X, Y, Z, only if you follow what I'm doing. And if not, then you're going to go to hell because God will be angry with you. There's, you know, the hellfire and brimstone kind of God. That's the assumption that the majority of SBNR people hold about Christianity. And it's hard, it's hard to break free of that assumption, because they're unwilling to experience anything different. Even if they were to come to, a place like this church or Pilgrim, or places where you don't talk about stuff like that, you don't believe stuff like that, they're going to read that into everything that they hear, because that's the assumption that they bring, most of them. And I think my biggest criticism of this particular, in this particular category, is that, yes, I'm not saying at all that religion does not need to be reformed. I'm not saying at all that there's no such thing as abuse or, wrong practices or wrong beliefs or things that are very harmful, even within our own denomination. We are going to have an incredibly contentious Synod Assembly coming up in June, because there's all kinds of stuff going on right now that is very, very difficult to grapple with, and very complicated in terms of human systems and relationships, and all of that is really important to work through and work with. But I think the problem for SBNR people is that what I'm describing is what community is about. And it's really hard work. Being in a community and having the support systems, the mutual support, the mutual correction of one another, the, working through your ideas and discussing them and kind of deciding together what God is calling you to do and what the meaning of life is and all these things, that's really hard work. Because if you're just you and you get to decide for yourself, there's nobody to argue with you. There's nobody else to consider. There's nobody else's experience to involve in their thought process. There's nobody else's opinion or needs to consider. You just do whatever you want. And it doesn't matter, because it's just for you. And ultimately, I think that a lot of SBNR people are SBNR because they don't want to do the work. Mm-hmm. And so they come up with these ideas about, how religion is awful and preventing me from having my spirituality, because that helps them to not feel guilty about what they're doing. It helps them to feel superior. We're down here in the trenches getting dirty and muddy in the relationships, in the messy, mucky relationships that it takes to be in a human community. And they get to sit up on their pedestal and say, well, look at me, I don't make any mistakes because my spirituality is my spirituality, and I don't bother anybody and I don't force anybody to do what I'm doing. And that is, to me, where I get upset with the SBNR people. Not just, oh, you guys are kind of selfish and egotistical and, whatever, but this is where I think it becomes ultimately harmful, not just to, to the individual, but to the kind of the larger whole. Because if you're trying to convince people that SBNR is better than religion, what you're telling them is that their inclination toward curved inwardness, their inclination toward selfishness is valid and valuable. And in fact, following that road is the way out, is the way to find true meaning in your life. And it's the complete opposite. I think, to me, the reason why I'm a Christian and not something else is not because I don't think that there's any value, it's not because I don't think there's value in those other traditions, but because I think that Christianity does the best job of describing where true meaning lies. And it's not in power, it's not in glory, it's not in places where I can be clean and free of any kind of marring or concern or worry that I did the wrong thing. True meaning is found in those messy places where there is no right or wrong answer, where everything is gray, where it's really difficult to navigate and try to move forward. That's where real meaning is. That's where real change is. That's where we find what it really means to be human. And so I think that SBNR is a load of garbage.
You got that right.
So, questions, comments before we wrap it up here?
Oh, come on, Kate, let us know what you really think.
I worked so hard hard to keep it in. I kept it in until this.
Well,
Okay.
I just keep thinking about, I wasn't born a Lutheran, and I sometimes feel like I'm out of step with those who are, people who are following the tradition of their family by being Lutheran. But because I wasn't, and because I joined as an adult, I had studied a lot of different and been a part of a lot of different churches and religions. I chose the Lutheran Church for a couple of reasons. One was Hartley Lee. He was a wonderful man. But the other one was because sitting in church, singing a hymn that was written in the 1200s or the whatevers, that it had been passed down through all these centuries and was still true. It just was a very spiritual thing for me. So that's why I struggle now with whether I should go to 8 o'clock or 10 o'clock, because I do like that. I do like the rituals and the things like that. And so I don't really understand what people who are saying that those things don't mean anything. I don't understand that.
Well, isn't it interesting that, the claim is that we don't judge, that anyone's welcome, that it's all about you finding your own way and your own path and your own meaningful spiritual practices. But don't go over there and sing those hymns because those are empty and void and nobody can get anything out of those.
Yeah.
There are rules, there are limits to what is acceptable and not acceptable in terms of where you find your spiritual meaning.
Right.
There was one day, a couple, 3 days after Christmas one year, Brian and I were in London and we went to Westminster we wound up going there for a church service. And I remember sitting there thinking, I thought this was Anglican because it looked so Catholic. It just jarred me for a moment. And then we started singing songs that I knew. And it was just like, it was just amazing. And everybody who was in there were hundreds of people in there. It was cool. It was meaningful. It was like being part of the group. It had meaning.
Mm-hmm. And my feeling is, how dare you tell me that that's not spirituality?
Yeah.
How dare you how dare you, person who is claiming that they have the right to find their spirituality wherever they want, how dare you tell me that I can't do that?
Exactly.
And that's where I get angry with the SBNR people.
Cheerio.
Yeah.
So I want to tell you a little story as we wrap this up today about that I think is applicable to this. When I was in seminary, I took an introduction to youth ministry class, and this was not even, this was not really part of the curriculum necessarily, but we were supposed to write up our spiritual journeys and how we were developing. We were talking about the stages of faith development that are similar to, like, if you're familiar with Freud's psychological development or Erik Erikson's psychosocial development. We were talking about the kind of the steps that most people take in their faith development stages. And so we were supposed to be telling our stories of how we developed up through these stages. And we were in a small group conversation one day, and I said, when I have children, I'm not going to force them to follow any particular religious tradition. I want them to be able to experiment and figure out what's going to work for them. And I thought I was being so open-minded and inclusive, and I didn't want my kids to end up in some awful place that they hated like I did. And so this is what I was going to do. And the PhD student who was leading our conversation said something to me that has really shaped a lot of the way that I work with youth and children and my own kids, and even the way that I think about my own spiritual development. He said, do you think that letting them dabble in a variety of things is going to help them to figure out what works for them and what doesn't better than growing up and deeply understanding a particular tradition and then allowing them to compare that to other possibilities? And I said, well, yes, of course. You know, if I raise them in a particular tradition, then they're going to be stuck there, like I was stuck there. And he said to me, I think you need to consider that soaking in that tradition as a child, being part of a particular tradition, and not assuming that your child is going to stay in that tradition forever, but giving them some basis, some language to use for expressing their spirituality and their religious desires is a much better way to help them to develop. In the same way that we don't say to our children, well, when you grow up, I want you to be able to speak any language you want. And so I'm going to teach you all the languages at once. You can't do that. You have to teach a child one language so that they can communicate, maybe two, maybe three. But generally speaking, you have to limit it. And as soon as, there are studies out there that as soon as a baby starts to hear the people around them speaking, they start to lose the ability to speak other languages like natives because they don't hear those sounds, and so they stop making them. Babies, when they're born, make all the sounds possible. And over the course of time, their mouths start to grow in such a way that they can't make certain sounds anymore. So that, for example, Bob can't roll his R's because he didn't grow up in a country where that was part of the language. We can't, if we started trying to learn that like clicking language from, I'm awful, I can't think of the tribe that speaks that way, but there's like a clicking language. We can't reproduce that in the same way that a native does because our mouths are already formed and you can't go back and fix that. But it's kind of the same thing, he said, in religion. You need a basis from which to start. And yes, that is going to do some limiting in terms of where you might go, or how you might interact with those other possibilities later in life, because like you said, Karen, you're going to feel a little bit foreign in those spaces, and that's true. But if you don't give them somewhere to start, a basis by which to compare and contrast, then they're actually not ever going to understand religion at all. Mm-hmm. Because you need that full immersion in a particular tradition so that you can understand what it does for you in all its fullness. And so I think that to me is what spiritual but not religious doesn't understand. That it doesn't have to be my way. There are tons of different Christian denominations. There are tons of different synagogues. You can find a place where you are most comfortable, but then I think what you have to do is buy into the idea that the community is more important than a lot of your personal preferences. That where you find the meaning is in the community itself, not in the type of music or the particular passages that are read or any of those types of things. And some people are going to find power in the rituals of certain areas and others aren't. The Lord's Prayer, for example. Some people will die on the hill of saying the Lord's Prayer with the traditional trespasses method, and that's the only way. Other people, like I actually myself, I didn't encounter the contemporary version of the Lord's Prayer until I was 25, 26. And I really like it because it makes me pay attention more than just reciting the words in the older version that I grew up with. So I really like that, but we don't use that at this church. Does that mean that I get up and leave because the version of the Lord's Prayer that I don't like is used? No, because it's about the community. It's about making sure that everybody has what they need to have as deep a spiritual life as possible, which also means not just kowtowing, but challenging them when they do, bring up a concern. Is this a legitimate, real thing that we really need to address? Or is this just being selfish and wanting to exclude other people so that you get what you want? Because that's what community is about. And I think that SBNR really minimizes that. And I think it also minimizes the value of ritual itself, of bringing those stories and those prayers and those songs into your subconscious. That there are so many stories after stories after stories of people with deep dementia, who can't even speak, don't know any of the names of the people around them, their loved ones, nothing. But if you start singing a certain hymn, they know all the words. There's something fundamental about that is a deep part of their identity. And you can't tell me that isn't spirituality when that happens. Even some of the songs that aren't necessarily memorized, I think are formative and can bring up moments of meaningful spiritual development in you. One of the hymns that always grabs me is Christ Be Our Light. I don't know if you have that at Pilgrim, Pam, but there's this one line where it's talking about how there are hungry people in the world and they don't have enough to eat, they don't have enough to drink. And it says, the lyrics say, make us your bread broken for others, shared until all are fed. And that just gets me every time. That phraseology, that poetry. Is that just rote ritual that I'm not getting anything out of? No, that is a deeply meaningful message in that moment. So I think that the SBNR people are really missing out, and I feel bad for them. Well, fundamentally.
Yeah, I agree. And I think I always felt like for my children, it was part of their education. There's a lot of things that go on in our world that are because of religion or whatever. And I feel like kids need to know. They need to have a strong argument, I guess is what you would say. But it doesn't mean that they'll always stay in the church. But my son, his wife is Catholic, and they go to the Catholic church in Davis. But he's always calling me and saying, but Mom, they say this and they say that. And he says, I don't think that's right. And I say, well, it's because you're Lutheran and you keep denying that. Because they're just enough different that it bugs him. And I said, so find a Lutheran church. We found a Lutheran church for them, so maybe they'll, but I don't think so, because she's pretty stuck. But
well, we had a minister once who had a Catholic wife, and so she always went to church earlier and then came to church in his service. So they spent 50 years doing that.
We had some people at our church did that.
Yeah, so
the wife went one place and the husband came to our church.
But he wasn't the minister. That was the really interesting part.
Yeah,
he was a minister. So yeah.
I had a friend in seminary whose father was a Presbyterian minister and his mother was a Catholic organist. And so depending on the week, he would go and sit while his mom played the organ during the Catholic service, or go and listen to his Presbyterian dad preach.
yeah.
How did he turn out?
I haven't talked to him since seminary, but he went to seminary to become a pastor in the Presbyterian church. So
Okay.
I guess he did okay.
Oh.
He definitely had a much higher appreciation of the ritual of worship and the liturgy than a lot of the rest of us did.
Yeah.
All right, well, to wrap us up, I did want to at least bring something of the Bible in, since we call this a Bible study. I wanted to just point out to you that even within our own tradition, we have this sense of, that it's not about the rituals themselves. It's not about the traditions themselves. It's about how those rituals and traditions form us. And it's very easy as Christians, I want to admit this, that it's very easy for us as Christians to forget that we just, we kind of do the motions and get it over with sometimes. And we go through those periods and seasons in our lives. But what God wants is not the ritual itself. What God wants is the formation of ourselves, the spiritual formation that comes from participating in those rituals, participating in those communities, refusing to turn away from the challenges of life together. And so this is just a brief reading from Isaiah chapter 1, verses 14 to 17 that I want to leave you with today. Your new moons and your appointed festivals, my soul hates. They have become a burden to me. I am weary of bearing them. When you stretch out your hands, I will hide my eyes from you. Even though you may make many prayers, I will not listen. Your hands are full of blood. Wash yourselves, make yourselves clean. Remove the evil of your doings from before my eyes. Cease to do evil, learn to do good. Seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, plead for the widow. So if an SBNR person ever tells you as a Christian that what you've got going on in your whole religious tradition is just dried up and void of any meaning, show them this. God has been telling the people of God for thousands of years that that's not what it's about. But there is value in the rituals themselves. There is value in the participation. You just have to use it. It's a tool. It's not the be all end all. It's not the purpose. And how dare they suggest otherwise?
Okay.
So that's what I have for today. Questions, comments, disagreements?
Well, I just think that probably everybody feels something different when they do the same thing. I mean, just because you're saying the same words or whatever doesn't mean everybody feels the same.
Yeah. And I'm not saying that my church is for everybody, different personalities aren't going to buy into it, but that's why there are so many different types. Your bad experience at one place doesn't mean that you should reject the whole thing and just go off on your own and decide that everybody who doesn't go off their own is a sheep,
Yeah. That whole thing about being sheep.
It seems like we need more common experiences to work together. And I spend some time wondering how we make that obvious in the world so that people will be drawn to common experiences like traditions, like religion, so that we can all behave better. So I'm not sure doing things on our own individually is going to help with that sense of community.
No.
And I worry about that for our world right now.
Yeah.
I do too.
Yeah. And I think that's a void that is going to be filled with something. Right now,
Yeah, right.
unfortunately,
The right thing.
right now it seems to be getting filled with what you hate. We connect to each other much more rapidly and strongly over things we hate than on things we share in common.
Yeah. Okay, well, there must be more to talk about next week then.
Well, so next week we are going to take a break because next week is Holy Week. And so
Okay.
there will be some Maundy Thursday services to attend. And I didn't want to step on any of that because I didn't know what we were going to have going on. So I have us off schedule for next week, but the following week, I'm so excited. We're going to have a huge crowd of people because we're going to advertise this heavily. And we're going to talk about a question. This is a legitimate question that I got from someone else. I did not make up this question. Are there aliens in the Bible?
I know, that's what Pam and I were talking about.
Well, I think we're aliens to somebody. Okay. 2 weeks.
I think it's going to be a lot of fun, and it'll be a good way for us to take a breather from all this heavy stuff. Although this one wasn't too bad.
No, it was interesting.
Yeah. Yes.
All right.
Thank you, Katie.
Thank you all. Have a great weekend. Happy Holy Week. Happy Easter.
Yes.
In a
Okay.
couple weeks.
Hey, take care of yourselves.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.